it was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
On January 9th, 2025, a 69-year-old filmmaker sat down across from most listened-to podcaster in the world and said something that most of Hollywood had spent 2 decades tiptoeing around. The filmmaker was Mel Gibson. The podcast was The Joe Rogan Experience, episode 2254. And what Gibson revealed that day wasn't a scandal or a secret. It was something arguably more uncomfortable for the industry that surrounds him. The plain, unfiltered story of how one of the most successful films in American box office history almost never got made, and why, 20 years later, its director is still fighting to finish what he started. This is that story. Not the exaggerated version. The real one. Gibson and Rogan didn't meet as strangers. Rogan had been circling the subject of Christianity for months before Gibson ever walked into the studio, most notably in a widely discussed episode with biblical scholar Wesley Huff, in which Rogan examined manuscript evidence for the New Testament and came away calling it fascinating. So when Gibson arrived, the ground was already prepared for a serious conversation, not a promotional one. It showed almost immediately. Rogan, describing himself as agnostic but raised Catholic, opened up a thought that clearly wasn't performative. He said that Christianity is treated differently than other faiths in secular Hollywood, that it's the one religion that you're allowed to disparage, and that progressive, open-minded people who embrace nearly every other belief system somehow make an exception for Christianity, treating it as a stand-in for colonialism, patriarchy, and everything considered culturally backward. Gibson agreed, though not uncritically. He was also candid about his own frustration with failures inside the Catholic Church itself, including bishops who covered up abuse. That exchange set the tone for nearly 3 hours. 2 men, one of them the son of a devout Catholic household, and the other openly still working out what he believes, talking through faith, filmmaking, and the 20-year shadow of a single movie, The Passion of the Christ. To understand what Gibson told Rogan, you have to go back to 2002 and 2003, when Gibson was trying to get The Passion of the Christ made. He was coming off the commercial and critical high of Braveheart, an Academy Award winner for Best Director. By any normal Hollywood logic, that success should have open doors. Instead, according to Gibson's own account on the podcast, the project met serious resistance the moment financiers understood what it actually was, a graphic, unflinching, Aramaic and Latin dramatization of the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ's life, filmed almost entirely as a description of suffering. Gibson explained his reasoning to Rogan directly. The idea, he said, was that everyone shares responsibility for the crucifixion, that Christ's sacrifice was made for all of humanity's failures, and that the story was fundamentally about redemption. It's a straightforward theological point, but it was apparently too big a swing for studios weighing box office risk against a subject matter this loaded. So Gibson did what very few directors at his level are willing to do. He financed it himself. Reports at the time, and in the years since, have put his personal investment at roughly $30 million. The film went on to gross $370.8 million domestically, making it the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history, a record that stood until Deadpool and Wolverine finally surpassed it 2 decades later, in 2024. Worldwide, the total climbed past $600 million. Nobody in the finance meetings that turned Gibson down had predicted that. Here is where the story of The Passion of the Christ stops being industry gossip and becomes something stranger, and where it's worth being precise about what is documented and what is exaggeration, because the film has accumulated 2 decades of internet lore, some of it true, some of it inflated well past the facts. What's well established, confirmed across multiple contemporaneous interviews, and later corroborated by Caviezel himself. During the final days of the shoot, while filming the Sermon on the Mount sequence in Italy, Jim Caviezel, who played Jesus, was struck by lightning. He has described feeling it coming seconds before it hit, watching people around him recoil, and later learning that flames briefly appeared near both sides of his head, which set his hair alight without seriously burning him. Assistant director Jan Michelini was reportedly struck twice during the production, once while sheltering under an umbrella beside Caviezel. Entertainment Weekly reported on these strikes at the time filming was underway, so this isn't a story that surfaced later to sell tickets. It was documented as it happened. The physical toll on Caviezel went well beyond the lightning. During the scourging scene, a stunt performer's whip missed its mark and struck Caviezel directly, an accident that left a lasting scar on his back and, according to his own account, briefly knocked the wind out of him. Carrying the cross, weighing well over 100 pounds by most reports, he dislocated his shoulder, a take Gibson kept in the final cut because the pain read as real, because it was. Caviezel also developed hypothermia and pneumonia while filming crucifixion scenes in freezing, wind-battered conditions on an exposed cliffside set. Years later, Caviezel confirmed the lightning strike had lasting cardiac effects, requiring 2 heart surgeries, the second at the Cleveland Clinic, in 2014. It's worth pausing on how this information has traveled. In 2021, a list of Caviezel's on-set injuries went viral on social media, and the fact-checking outlet Snopes examined it. Their conclusion was that the core claims, the lightning strike, the whipping accident, the dislocated shoulder, the hypothermia, check out against contemporaneous reporting and Caviezel's own statements, even though the story had been passed around online for years in a form stripped of its sourcing. That's a useful distinction to hold on to. The injuries are real and documented, but the internet's habit of retelling them without context has occasionally made the story sound more mythologized than the underlying facts actually require. Other cast transformations during filming are also on the record, not as supernatural claims, but as accounts the people involved have given directly. Luca Leonello, the Italian actor who played Judas Iscariot, has described himself as having been an angry atheist before filming began. According to a National Catholic Register interview with Father John Bardenek, a priest who spent 2 years observing the production and later wrote a book about it, Leonello asked for confession near the end of the shoot, was baptized along with his children, and returned to the Catholic Church. Wikipedia's biography of Leonello corroborates that he became Catholic in 2004 as a direct result of the experience. Maya Morgenstern, the Romanian actress who played Mary, discovered she was pregnant with her 3rd child partway through the 4-month shoot, a fact she confirmed herself in interviews with the Associated Press at the time, describing it as lending an unplanned luminosity to her performance that no amount of makeup could replicate. Morgenstern is Jewish, the granddaughter of a Holocaust victim, and has spoken publicly and consistently about not viewing the film as anti-Semitic, a point that becomes relevant later in this story. What you won't find independently verified in credible reporting are some of the more elaborate claims that have circulated online over the years, stories of mass healings or medical miracles among extras and crew. Those anecdotes exist mostly as second-hand retellings without named sources or documentation, and a careful accounting of this film's production has to draw a line between what witnesses have gone on record about and what has simply accumulated as legend. The verified material is dramatic enough on its own. When The Passion of the Christ reached theaters on Ash Wednesday, February 25, 2004, the critical reaction split sharply, and understanding that split matters more than picking a side in it. Roger Ebert, then the most influential film critic in America, gave the movie a full 4 stars in Chicago Sun-Times, calling it the most violent film he had ever seen, and meaning that as a description of Gibson's intent rather than a condemnation. Ebert wrote that the film gave him, for the first time, a visceral sense of what The Passion actually consisted of, and he devoted much of his review to defending the film against charges of anti-Semitism, later writing a separate follow-up column arguing critics should see the film before judging it. Times' Richard Corliss also praised it as a serious, technically accomplished work radiating total commitment to its subject. Other prominent critics disagreed just as strongly. Newsweek's David Anson wrote that the film's relentless violence was self-defeating, saying he felt punished rather than moved by it. Slate's David Edelstein was similarly skeptical. The split wasn't along predictable lines, either. Some religious commentators objected to the film's brutality on the grounds that it overwhelmed its spiritual message, while some secular critics praised its craftsmanship even while disliking its content. The most serious controversy, though, came from religious scholars and Jewish organizations who reviewed the script before release and raised concerns that specific portrayals, the depiction of Jewish religious leaders, crowd scenes calling for Jesus' death, echoed imagery that has historically been used to justify anti-Semitic violence. This wasn't a fringe objection. It came from serious scholars with legitimate historical grounds for concern, given how passion plays have been weaponized in the past. Gibson maintained, both at the time and later to Rogan, that his intent was to depict collective human responsibility for the crucifixion, not to single out any one group, a reading Ebert and Maya Morgenstern both endorsed in their own separate statements. The debate was never fully resolved, and it shouldn't be flattened into either the film was clearly hateful or the controversy was manufactured. Both careful defenders and careful critics of the film have made real arguments, and reasonable people who've actually watched it have landed on different sides. What's not in dispute is the film's cultural impact. Churches across the country organized group screenings. It became, for a period, one of the most talked about films in a generation, generating cover stories in Time and Newsweek before it even opened. Whatever your view of its content, it did something vanishingly rare for a modern studio-scale release. It made millions of people who don't normally engage with religious cinema show up and argue about it. The most pointed material in the JRE conversation wasn't really about the film's plot. It was about the environment Gibson had to make it in. Gibson described watching colleagues who had worked with him for years go quiet once word got out about the project's subject matter. He framed it less as active sabotage and more as a kind of institutional cold shoulder. Financing that should have been straightforward for an Oscar-winning director simply wasn't there. Whether you read that as evidence of anti-Christian bias in the entertainment industry or as ordinary risk aversion around a historically divisive subject probably depends on your own priors. Both readings have some support. Studios routinely balk at religiously charged material regardless of which religion is involved, because it's genuinely difficult to market films that large swaths of the audience will either love or actively boycott. At the same time, Gibson isn't alone in observing that faith-based content aimed specifically at Christian audiences has often been treated by mainstream critics and studio executives with more open skepticism than comparable content built around other belief systems, a pattern several other filmmakers and industry commentators have noted over the years, even if they disagree about the cause. This is a genuinely contested point, not a settled fact, and it's worth holding it that way rather than treating Gibson's framing as the final word. The part of the conversation most likely to generate headlines going forward was Gibson's update on a long gestating sequel, tentatively called The Passion of the Christ, Resurrection. Gibson told Rogan he and screenwriter Randall Wallace, his collaborator on Braveheart, have been developing the project for roughly 6 to 7 years. Gibson has described it in other interviews as spanning an enormous scope, from the fall of the angels through to the death of the last apostle, essentially using the resurrection as a hinge point for a much larger cosmic narrative rather than a simple continuation of the first film's plot. Caviezel, who is attached to reprise his role, has separately confirmed that a script exists and that financing shouldn't be difficult given the original film's box office performance. As of Gibson's conversation with Rogan, the project was described as being in pre-production, with Gibson indicating he wanted to be personally and spiritually prepared before beginning to shoot. Filming has been reported in some outlets as targeted for later in 2026 in Italy, though release date estimates for this project have shifted multiple times since it was first announced around 2016, and a firm date has not been confirmed by Gibson or Icon Productions. On the podcast, Gibson also laid out the reasoning that, for him, makes the resurrection the most demanding part of the story to believe and the most important to get right. He pointed to the apostles' willingness to die rather than recant their testimony as evidence he finds compelling, arguing, in his own words, that people don't typically go to their deaths defending something they know to be a lie. It's a classical apologetic argument, one that predates Gibson by centuries, but it clearly forms the emotional core of why he spent 2 decades of his career circling this subject. It would be easy to turn this story into either a hagiography of Gibson as a persecuted truth-teller or a cynical dismissal of the whole conversation as calculated controversy baiting. Neither framing holds up well against the actual record. What actually happened is more modest and, in its way, more interesting. A filmmaker with a genuinely difficult, expensive, and personally risky project got it made against real financial resistance, working with a cast and crew who experienced real hardships and, in at least 2 documented cases, real changes of belief. The film that resulted was excellent by some critical standards and troubling by others, and both of those reactions came from serious people making serious arguments. 2 decades later, that same filmmaker is still trying to finish the story he set out to tell, using one of the largest media platforms in the world to explain why it matters to him. None of that requires embellishment. The real story, verified lightning strikes, a scourging accident that left a permanent scar, a shoulder dislocated on camera and left in the film, an atheist actor who returned to the Catholic Church, a pregnant actress who found her role changed by the process, a critic's rave sitting next to serious and legitimate concerns about the film's portrayal of its antagonists, is dramatic enough without needing invented miracles attached to it. That, in the end, is closer to what Gibson was actually getting at when he sat down with Rogan. Not that something supernatural was hidden in the footage, but that making something honest about suffering and sacrifice cost him something real, and that 20 years later, people are still arguing about whether it was worth it. Given the film's box office record, its lasting cultural footprint, and the fact that its sequel is still being anticipated 2 decades on, it's hard to argue that nobody wanted the story told. They just didn't all agree then or now on what the